In just 25 years, a single empire conquered more territory than Rome amassed over 4 centuries. This wasn't luck, it was the result of calculated terror, precision, and an arsenal of brutal tactics that left civilizations trembling in their wake. The Mongol horde didn't just fight battles, they rewrote the rules of war under Genghis Khan, crafting strategies so effective that modern militaries still study them today. What made these warriors unstoppable? Was it their legendary horseback archery, their psychological games, or something far darker? From feigned retreats that lured enemies into slaughter to the chilling use of siege warfare that leveled cities, we're uncovering the 30 most ruthless tactics that built history's largest land empire. This isn't just a story of conquest, it's a masterclass in domination, where every move was designed to break enemies before blades even clashed. The Mongols didn't just win wars, they shattered the will to resist, and here's exactly how they did it. The battlefield was the Mongols' chessboard, and their opening move often began with a lie. Picture this: a seemingly disorganized horde of horseback warriors suddenly breaking formation, scattering in wild retreat. To their enemies, it looked like victory was within reach. What they didn't realize, they were charging straight into a death trap. The feigned retreat wasn't just a trick, it was psychological warfare perfected over decades of conquest. When European knights or Middle Eastern cavalry gave chase, they abandoned their tight formations, stretching supply lines thin and tiring their horses. That's when the Mongols struck, wheeling around with terrifying precision. They'd rain arrows from all sides, cutting off escape routes before closing in for the kill. At the Battle of Kalka River, this tactic spelled doom for an entire coalition of ruse princes. Lured deep into Mongol-controlled terrain, their forces were systematically dismantled, not just defeated but obliterated. Survivors spoke of chaos so complete that commanders couldn't even sound retreat before being surrounded. But here's the real genius: the feigned retreat wasn't just about winning battles. It rewired how enemies fought. After Kalka, armies hesitated to pursue Mongol forces, always haunted by the fear of another trap. That hesitation gave Genghis Khan's generals the upper hand before combat even began. Few military strategies have ever wielded fear so effectively, turning mere deception into an empire-building weapon. But the Mongols didn't just rely on deception, they also perfected the art of overwhelming firepower. Imagine standing on an open battlefield, watching as the horizon darkens with thousands of arrows soaring toward you. Before your army could even get close enough to strike, the sky itself turned against you. This was the arrow storm, a tactic so devastating that it often decided battles before hand-to-hand combat even began. Mongol archers didn't just shoot, they unleashed a ceaseless, calculated deluge of death. Their signature composite bows, crafted from layers of sinew, wood, and horn, could launch arrows farther and with more force than anything their enemies possessed. And unlike foot archers who had to stand still to aim, Mongol warriors fired with deadly accuracy while galloping at full speed. The result? Enemy formations would break apart under the relentless hail, their ranks thinning long before they had a chance to retaliate. At the Battle of Mohyj, Hungarian forces armed with European-style crossbows that took far longer to reload were decimated by this very strategy, their lines collapsing under arrows that never seemed to stop. What made the arrow storm truly terrifying wasn't just its lethality, it was the psychological toll. The constant whistle of incoming projectiles, the screams of those struck down, the inability to even see the attackers clearly, all of it chipped away at morale. Soldiers who survived the initial barrage often arrived at close combat already broken in spirit, making them easy prey for Mongol horsemen waiting to finish the job. This wasn't just archery, it was a symphony of destruction, each volley timed to maximize terror and minimize resistance. Few armies in history ever mastered ranged warfare with such ruthless efficiency. Few military leaders in history wielded psychological terror as deliberately or as effectively as Genghis Khan. The Mongols didn't just defeat their enemies physically, they shattered their will to resist long before combat even began. When a city dared to fight back, the consequences were brutally simple: total destruction. Walls were torn down, populations were wiped out, and in some cases, the land itself was salted to ensure nothing could grow there again. This wasn't mindless violence, it was a calculated strategy. The massacre of Nishapur in 1221 wasn't just about revenge for the death of a Mongol general. It was a message carved into history, echoing across trade routes and war councils. Stories spread of streets choked with corpses, of pyramids built from skulls. By the time the Mongols approached the next city, terrified leaders often threw open their gates, preferring submission to slaughter. What made this tactic so chillingly effective wasn't just the scale of the violence, it was the precision behind it. The Mongols spared artisans, scholars, and anyone with useful skills, integrating them into their empire. The rest, they became part of the warning. Fear became their recruiter, their diplomat, their advance force. Why waste soldiers storming a fortress when the mere mention of the Mongol approach could dissolve enemy alliances and send garrisons fleeing? Terror wasn't a side effect of conquest, it was the engine that powered it. Few empires ever turned dread into such a potent strategic weapon. When the enemy expected an army, what arrived was a blur of dust and hooves moving faster than any messenger could warn of their approach. The Mongols didn't march, they flowed across the land like a storm, covering distances that would cripple other armies. Each warrior rode a string of tough, nimble horses, switching mounts to maintain relentless speed. While European knights lumbered forward in heavy armor, Mongol riders could traverse 100 miles in a single day, appearing where they were least expected, then melting back into the steppes before retaliation was even possible. This wasn't just speed, it was a complete redefinition of warfare. Commanders like Subutai treated the battlefield as a vast, shifting puzzle, launching raids hundreds of miles apart in mere days to convince enemies they faced multiple forces. During the invasion of Khwarezmia, cities hundreds of miles apart fell almost simultaneously, their defenders stunned by an army that seemed to defy the laws of time and space. By the time one garrison realized they were under attack, Mongols were already sacking another stronghold entirely. What truly set them apart was their decentralized structure. Unlike rigid armies that moved as a single, slow mass, Mongol units operated like a pack of wolves spread out but always in sync. Junior officers had the freedom to adapt on the fly, regrouping at predetermined locations to strike from multiple angles. Enemies who tried to chase one unit would suddenly find themselves flanked by 3 more. Mobility didn't just win battles, it made resistance feel futile. When your foe could be anywhere, nowhere was safe. While the Mongols were masters of terror and speed on the battlefield, their true edge came from something far more sophisticated: an ancient communication network so advanced it would rival modern logistics. Stretching across thousands of miles, the Yam system was the nervous system of the empire, moving information faster than any rumor of the horde's approach. Picture a rider thundering into a relay station, sweat-streaked and dust-covered, swapping his exhausted horse for a fresh one in seconds before racing onward. These couriers weren't just messengers, they were the lifeblood of Mongol dominance. Unlike the sluggish medieval postal systems of Europe, where letters could take months to reach their destination, the Mongols built a highway of intelligence. Stations stocked with fresh horses and supplies were spaced every 20 to 30 miles, allowing urgent reports to traverse 200 miles in a single day. When a scout spotted an enemy army regrouping or a city's defenses weakening, that intelligence didn't just reach commanders, it outran the enemy's own preparations. During the invasion of Hungary, the Yam's speed meant Batu Khan could adjust his entire campaign based on real-time reconnaissance, encircling forces before they even knew he'd changed tactics. But the system's real genius lay in its dual purpose. Alongside military dispatches, Yam riders carried census data, trade inventories, and even diplomatic decrees, binding the empire's vast territories into a cohesive whole. Merchants traveling under Mongol protection used these same routes, their caravans weaving between stations like threads in a grand tapestry of control. To control such an empire, Genghis Khan didn't just need fear, he needed flawless coordination. The Yam ensured that whether a rebellion flared in Persia or a new opportunity arose in China, the Mongols reacted not as a scattered force, but as a single, terrifyingly efficient organism. No medieval power ever replicated this blend of ruthlessness and bureaucratic brilliance because no one else could match the discipline required to sustain it. The Mongols didn't just conquer empires, they absorbed them, stealing the best ideas and weaponry from every civilization they crushed. While other conquerors dismissed foreign technology as inferior, Genghis Khan's generals actively sought out innovations, transforming them into tools of their own domination. When they encountered Chinese engineers capable of building trebuchets that could hurl 100-pound stones, they didn't destroy them, they drafted them. Within months, these same siege engines were raining fire on cities that had once been their creators' allies. This wasn't just opportunistic, it was systematic. After every victory, Mongol commanders conducted a grim inventory, scouring battlefields and workshops for anything that could give them an advantage. Persian siege towers, Central Asian flame projectors, even European armor designs, all were stripped, studied, and redeployed. At the siege of Baghdad, the same walls that had repelled invaders for centuries crumpled under Mongol assault, partly because the attackers now wielded advanced battering rams and gunpowder weapons reverse-engineered from Chinese prototypes. But the real brilliance lay in how they adapted these tools to their mobile warfare. Unlike slow-moving European armies that dragged cumbersome siege equipment, the Mongols disassembled trebuchets into portable parts, hauling them on horseback and reassembling them on site. Their enemies would wake to the sound of wooden frames being constructed just beyond arrow range, a nightmare made from their own discarded blueprints. No other empire in history turned learning into such a devastating weapon, proving that the deadliest warriors weren't always the strongest, but the ones who refused to stop evolving. Genghis Khan didn't just command an army, he built a machine. At its core was a deceptively simple organizing principle, the decimal system. Every unit, from the smallest squad to the largest division, was structured in multiples of 10, a radical departure from the tangled feudal hierarchies of Europe or the dynastic nepotism of China. 10 warriors formed an arban, answerable to a leader chosen for skill, not bloodline. 10 arbans made a zone of 100, and so on, scaling up to the fearsome 2 men, 10,000 horsemen moving as one. This wasn't just about numbers, it was about control. While medieval kings struggled with rebellious lords and unreliable levies, Mongol officers maintained ironclad discipline because they'd earned their rank through battlefield results. A commander who hesitated or failed could be replaced on the spot by someone more capable, keeping the entire army razor sharp. Promotion wasn't a birthright, it was a reward for courage, quick thinking, and loyalty. That meritocracy bred fierce devotion. A warrior didn't fight for some distant noble's glory, he fought alongside men who'd proven themselves, for leaders who'd risen the same way he hoped to. The real brilliance of this system shone in combat. Unlike rigid European formations that required centralized orders, Mongol units could adapt instantly. If a commander fell, the next in line took over without hesitation, maintaining the flow of battle. During the invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire, this fluidity allowed scattered Mongol forces to regroup mid-retreat, pivoting from defensive maneuvers to sudden counterattacks that left their enemies reeling. While rival armies collapsed under confused leadership, the decimal structure turned chaos into opportunity. No other military of its time could decentralize command without descending into anarchy, but the Mongols thrived on it. Beyond the battlefield, this structure doubled as an administrative spine for history's largest land empire. Tax collection, census-taking, even postal relays all operated through the same decimal chains, ensuring that the horde's reach extended far beyond the edge of its swords. In the end, Genghis Khan's greatest innovation wasn't the composite bow or the feigned retreat. It was the blueprint for an empire that moved, fought, and governed as a single, seamless force. For all their skill in open combat, the Mongols understood something most medieval armies overlooked. Sometimes the deadliest weapon wasn't a blade but an empty stomach. When faced with towering stone walls or impassable fortresses, they didn't waste lives in futile assaults. Instead, they waged war on the land itself. Crops were torched before they could ripen. Wells were tainted with carcasses or outright demolished. Supply caravans were intercepted miles from their destinations, leaving garrisons to slowly wither behind their own defenses. This wasn't just sabotage, it was strategic suffocation. In the siege of Zhongdu, modern-day Beijing, the Mongols didn't bother storming the city's legendary double walls. They sealed every road, strangling trade until starvation did what swords could not. Within months, a metropolis built to withstand years of siege crumbled from within, its defenders too weak to lift their weapons. The brilliance lay in its efficiency. Why lose thousands of soldiers when hunger could dismantle an enemy army for you? But the psychological impact cut deeper than physical deprivation. As food stores dwindled, desperation fractured discipline. Stories spread of besieged troops turning on civilians, eating leather, even resorting to cannibalism, all while Mongol forces waited just beyond arrow range, fresh and well-fed. When surrender finally came, it wasn't just acceptance of defeat, but shattered morale that ensured no rebellion would rise afterward. Starvation didn't just conquer cities, it erased the will to resist long after the Mongols rode away. What made this tactic truly terrifying was its universality. Against nomadic tribes, the Mongols drove off livestock herds, stealing not just food but centuries of accumulated wealth. In agricultural regions, they timed campaigns to destroy harvests, ensuring famine lingered for years. Even if an army survived the initial onslaught, the land beneath them became a barren ally to their conquerors. No walls could shield against an enemy who weaponized the earth itself. The Mongol Empire didn't just conquer through brute force, they mastered the art of deception long before blades ever crossed. Genghis Khan understood that the quickest path to victory sometimes wasn't on the battlefield, but through whispers and broken promises. To outsiders, these alliances appeared generous, offers of trade, mutual defense, even shared spoils of war. But in reality, every outstretched hand concealed a knife. Take the Khwarezmian Empire, a powerhouse that stretched across Persia and Central Asia. Before launching his invasion, Genghis sent envoys bearing gifts and proposals of peaceful commerce. The Shah, suspicious but enticed by the prospect of wealth, allowed trade caravans to cross his borders. What he didn't realize, those caravans carried Mongol scouts mapping key forts, counting garrison numbers, and gauging regional loyalties. When conflict finally erupted, Genghis didn't face a united enemy. He exploited fractures his diplomats had carefully widened. Cities that might have rallied together instead hesitated, unsure which local rivals had already secretly sided with the Mongols. But the betrayal ran deeper than espionage. Once an ally outlived their purpose, the horde turned on them with chilling efficiency. Tribes that helped Mongol armies navigate mountain passes later found their villages burned. Defectors promised safety were often slaughtered to prevent future resistance. This wasn't mere cruelty, it was calculated strategy. Potential enemies learned a grim lesson. Trust was a luxury they couldn't afford. By the time the Mongols encircled the next target, many chose surrender over risking another fatal double cross. What made this tactic so devastating was its universality. From the steppes to the Silk Road, every culture understood alliances, but none weaponized them like the Mongols. While European kings fought with rigid codes of honor, Genghis treated diplomacy like a game of chess, every move designed to isolate the opponent's king. The result, empires crumbled not just from external assault, but from the rot of internal doubt his false friendships planted. In the end, the most dangerous Mongol weapon wasn't the bow or the sword, it was the illusion of mercy. Few things shattered an enemy's morale like waking to the thunder of hooves in pitch darkness. While medieval armies huddled around campfires, blind to the world beyond their flickering light, Mongol warriors moved like shadows guided by a biological edge few understood at the time. Their diet of fermented mare's milk, raw liver, and steppe herbs packed with vitamin A sharpened their night vision to near superhuman levels. Where others saw only blackness, they saw targets. This wasn't just opportunistic raiding, it was deliberate, systematic terror. Under the veil of night, entire Mongol regiments could encamp within arrow shot of an enemy position without detection. Then, at a silent signal, hell erupted, drums pounded suddenly from all directions, flaming arrows arced into supply tents, war cries echoed from nowhere and everywhere at once. By the time defenders fumbled for their weapons, their ranks were already in disarray, slashing at phantoms while Mongol blades cut them down from the edges inward. The invasion of Hungary showcased this tactic's brutal efficiency. After days of feigned retreats, Batu Khan's forces vanished at dusk only to reappear deep behind Hungarian lines under moonless skies. Knights clad in heavy armor tripped over tent ropes while Mongol riders, unburdened by bulky equipment, picked them off with clinical precision. By dawn, entire divisions had collapsed without ever seeing their attackers clearly. But the true mastery lay in what came after. Survivors spread tales of an enemy that didn't just fight in darkness, they owned it. That psychological scar ran deeper than any battlefield loss. Future foes would lie awake at night, straining their eyes at every rustle, their exhaustion mounting as surely as the Mongol advantage. When your enemy never lets you sleep, surrender starts to feel like rest. The Mongols turned distraction into an art form where other armies saw chaos, they saw opportunity. Picture a fortress garrison scrambling to defend their eastern wall as a screaming horde of riders storms the gates. But just as defenders rally to repel the assault, the real threat emerges silently from the opposite direction. This was no disorganized raid, it was a surgical strike disguised as mayhem. At the Battle of Mohi, this tactic shattered the Hungarian army. As Batu Khan's forces feigned a frantic retreat across the Sojo River, they left behind a smokescreen of burning tents and panicked shouts. Hungarian knights, convinced they'd routed the invaders, gave chase only to discover too late that the retreat was cover for an entire Mongol division fording the river upstream. By the time they realized their mistake, the flanking force had already torn through their supply trains and cut off any hope of retreat. What made these diversionary strikes so lethal wasn't just the misdirection, it was the precision. Unlike European commanders who relied on rigid battle plans, Mongol leaders orchestrated chaos like conductors. A handful of riders might bait a cavalry charge away from the main fight, while others set grass fires to mask troop movements. Every feint served multiple purposes, exhausting enemy horses, testing defensive responses, and most crucially, convincing opponents they held the advantage right before the trap snapped shut. The true brilliance lay in how these tactics preyed on human nature. When faced with apparent weakness, even seasoned warriors often abandoned strategy for the thrill of pursuit. The Mongols didn't just exploit that impulse, they weaponized it. By the time their enemies recognized the ruse, the battle was already over. In the end, their greatest strength wasn't just their skill with a bow, it was their mastery of making their foes outthink themselves into defeat. The Mongol horde didn't just break the rules of war, they rewrote them with chilling pragmatism. When faced with heavily fortified positions or treacherous terrain, they turned their captives into living armor. Imagine being a defender atop your city walls, arrows nocked, only to see a desperate tide of your own people stumbling forward, women, children, even soldiers from previously conquered towns herded at spear point toward your gates. Every shot you fired would claim one of your own before ever touching a Mongol warrior. This was psychological warfare distilled to its cruelest essence. Forced to choose between slaughtering their countrymen or holding fire and allowing the horde to advance unopposed, many garrisons froze in agonized indecision. At the siege of Nishapur, chroniclers described defenders weeping as they lowered their bows, unable to shoot into the mass of prisoners driven forward like cattle. Those who resisted faced a grisly calculus: expend precious arrows cutting down innocents, or watch as the human tide cleared a path for siege ladders and battering rams. Either way, the Mongols won without losing a single warrior. Beyond the battlefield, this tactic sent a ripple of terror through entire regions. Word spread that surrender might spare your city, but resistance guaranteed you'd become a weapon against your own people. The sheer efficiency was horrifying. Why waste Mongol lives when your enemies could deplete their own resources for you? Even the act of taking prisoners transformed into a strategic reserve, with captives catalogued not just as slaves, but as expendable assets for future sieges. No other conquerors weaponized compassion so ruthlessly, turning their foes' humanity into their greatest vulnerability. Yet beneath the brutality lay cold logic. Every prisoner absorbed an arrow that would have killed a trained warrior. Every moment of hesitation gave Mongol engineers time to assemble siege engines. And every shattered defender who later surrendered carried the lesson deeper into the empire. Resistance didn't just risk death, it forced you to become an accomplice in your own destruction. The Mongols didn't just exploit weakness, they engineered dilemmas where every choice was a form of defeat. When the Mongols appeared to retreat, it wasn't just warriors vanishing into the steppes, it was the land itself turning against their enemies. As Mongol forces withdrew, they left behind a smoldering wasteland, crops torched, wells poisoned, villages reduced to ash. This wasn't desperation, it was strategy distilled to its most brutal logic. Why fight an invading army when you could starve it into submission? The Khwarezmian Empire learned this lesson the hard way. After initial clashes, their forces pursued what seemed like a fleeing Mongol contingent, only to find every farm, every granary, every water source systematically obliterated. Horses grew weak without pasture, soldiers marched on empty stomachs. By the time they reached Mongol strongholds, exhaustion and thirst had eroded their strength, leaving them vulnerable to a vicious counterattack. The very act of chasing the Mongols became a death sentence, not because of arrows or blades, but because the earth beneath their feet had been weaponized. What made this tactic so devastating was its long-term impact. Unlike conventional defenses that merely delayed invaders, scorched earth ensured those invaders could never return. Regions once capable of sustaining armies became barren, dead zones, forcing future enemies to carry every scrap of supplies with them, slowing their advance to a crawl. The Mongols didn't just defend territory, they erased its utility, turning their homeland into a lethal trap for anyone foolish enough to follow. Yet there was a grim elegance to its execution. By burning their own lands, the Mongols demonstrated a psychological edge. They would sacrifice anything to win. That willingness to endure hardship, to leave their own people homeless if necessary, sent a message no enemy could ignore. Resistance wasn't just futile, it invited annihilation on a scale that reshaped the land itself. In the end, their greatest defense wasn't walls or forts, but the ruthless understanding that survival sometimes meant destroying the very things others fought to protect. Even the mightiest warriors falter when exhaustion takes hold, and the Mongols turned that inevitable weakness into a systematic weapon. Unlike traditional armies that committed all forces at once, Mongol commanders orchestrated attacks like a shifting tide, sending fresh units into the fray just as the enemy began to tire. Each wave struck with the same ferocity as the first, giving defenders no respite, no moment to regroup. Fatigue wasn't just a consequence of battle, it was the blueprint for victory. At Legnica in 1241, this approach devastated some of Europe's most heavily armored knights. The initial Mongol charges weren't designed to win outright. They were probes, testing weaknesses and draining stamina. Just as the knights rallied after repelling one assault, another wave of riders would emerge, their horses still strong, their arrows still raining down. Over hours, the cumulative strain became unbearable. Plate armor, once a mark of invincibility, turned into a suffocating weight. Swords grew too heavy to lift. By the time the Mongols committed their freshest reserves, the enemy could barely raise their shields. But the true mastery lay in the flexibility of these waves. If a unit faltered, it withdrew seamlessly while another took its place, maintaining unrelenting pressure. European chroniclers likened it to fighting a river. Every time one current was blocked, another surged around it. While feudal armies relied on single, decisive clashes, the Mongols turned combat into a war of attrition where they controlled the tempo. Against such a foe, even victory in the first skirmish meant nothing. The real battle began when your muscles burned and your vision blurred, and the horde showed no signs of stopping. This tactic exploited a universal truth: courage falters when the body breaks. By the time their enemies realized they weren't just fighting warriors but an entire system designed to grind them down, it was already too late. The Mongols didn't just outfight their opponents, they outlasted them, turning fatigue into an invisible ally that sapped the will to resist long before the killing blow landed. The Mongols understood a fundamental truth of warfare. Sometimes appearing invincible was more powerful than actually being invincible. When their numbers alone couldn't intimidate, they crafted illusions so convincing that cities surrendered without a single arrow being loosed. This wasn't just trickery, it was psychological dominance, a way to turn fear into an invisible army fighting on their behalf. Take Nishapur, where defenders peered from their ramparts to see a Mongol force stretching to the horizon. But many of those distant warriors were nothing more than straw-stuffed dummies lashed to spare horses, their silhouettes indistinguishable from real soldiers at a distance. The Rus exploited a universal weakness: the human mind fills in gaps with its own dread. By the time the truth became obvious, morale had already crumbled, and the city's leaders were bartering for terms rather than testing their luck in battle. What made this tactic so effective was its versatility. In open terrain, decoy horsemen could flank enemy formations, creating the illusion of encirclement. During sieges, torches moved between dummy positions, convinced defenders the Mongols were massing for a nighttime assault, forcing them to exhaust their watchmen. Even when foes suspected deception, the risk of underestimating the horde's true strength paralyzed decision-making. Fear of the unknown often proved deadlier than any blade. But beneath the theatrics lay meticulous calculation. The Mongols didn't just rely on dummies, they amplified the illusion with dust clouds kicked up by riderless horses, drummer corps spaced to echo like a vast host, and carefully timed movements that exaggerated their presence. Every element conspired to make their army seem limitless because in war, perception could bend reality. Why sacrifice warriors storming a gate when a well-placed scare could make that same gate swing open willingly? The greatest Mongol victories weren't always won with steel. They were won in the minds of men already defeated by their own imagination. While most armies sought to crush their enemies in one decisive clash, the Mongols played a longer game, one where isolation was the prelude to annihilation. Their strategy wasn't just about defeating opponents, it was about systematically dismantling their ability to fight back. Picture a vast Jin dynasty army, its divisions stretched across valleys and mountain passes, confident in their superior numbers. Then, without warning, Mongol cavalry would sever supply lines, block retreat routes, and turn each separated contingent into a stranded island, cut off from reinforcements, command, or hope. This wasn't chaotic skirmishing, it was surgical precision. At the Battle of Yehuling in 1211, the Mongols didn't engage the Jin's massive force head-on. Instead, they lured units into narrow terrain where their numbers meant nothing. Once trapped, these isolated pockets were methodically erased, first with arrows, then with blades, and finally with the psychological terror of knowing no help would come. The Jin, renowned for their disciplined infantry, found their formations useless when every attempted regroup was met with another Mongol wedge driving deeper between them. What made this tactic so devastating was its ripple effect. As word spread of entire divisions vanishing without a trace, surviving troops grew paralyzed by indecision. Officers hesitated to move without explicit orders, fearing they'd be the next to be singled out. Supply convoys stalled, unsure which roads were still secure. By the time the Mongols struck the heart of the Jin army, it was already a hollow shell, its strength sapped not by one great battle, but by 100 small ones it never had the chance to fight. But the real genius lay in how the Mongols exploited the very infrastructure of their enemies. While European knights relied on castles or walled cities for refuge, steppe warfare had no such sanctuaries. Every severed supply line, every intercepted messenger tightened the noose further. Against the Jin, they didn't just defeat an army, they dismantled an entire military culture built around centralized command. In the end, their greatest weapon wasn't the sword, but the deliberate, merciless act of turning strength into weakness, one isolated unit at a time. The walls of Baghdad had stood for centuries, surviving countless sieges, until the Mongols arrived not with battering rams, but with a horror show designed to break minds before breaching stone. As defenders peered from their ramparts, they witnessed a procession of mutilated survivors from fallen cities, some missing hands or ears, others forced to march with the severed heads of their own leaders lashed to their backs. This wasn't just cruelty, it was a psychological masterstroke, turning the very act of resistance into a theater of dread. Unlike traditional siege tactics that relied on starvation or bombardment, the Mongols weaponized spectacle. Captives were forced to reenact their city's last moments, digging mass graves, building makeshift scaffolds, even forming human ladders against Baghdad's walls to demonstrate the futility of defense. Each performance hammered home the same message: surrender now or become part of tomorrow's grim parade. Chroniclers described defenders vomiting from sheer terror, their weapons slipping from trembling fingers long before the first Mongol soldier set foot inside. But what made this tactic so devastating wasn't just its brutality, it was its precision. The Mongols tailored their psychological assaults to local fears. In Buddhist regions, they desecrated temples to undermine spiritual resolve. In mercantile hubs like Baghdad, they displayed looted treasures to fuel greed and internal betrayal. Fear became a self-fulfilling prophecy. The moment defenders hesitated to shoot at advancing prisoners, the siege was already lost. Walls manned by broken men might as well have been left unguarded. History remembers the Mongols for their military innovations, but their true genius lay in understanding human nature. While other conquerors measured strength in soldiers or supplies, Genghis Khan's generals calculated it in screams and whispers. Why waste months starving a city into submission when a single, well-orchestrated nightmare could make its gates swing open by dawn? The lesson was clear. The quickest path to victory often bypassed the battlefield entirely, cutting straight through the psyche of those who dared to stand in their way. Tactic 18. The horse archer swarm few sight struck terror into the heart of an enemy army like the sudden blur of dust and movement as Mongol riders materialized on all sides. What began as a distant thunder of hooves quickly became an inescapable storm, a swirling vortex of horsemen, each loosing arrows with terrifying precision while staying just out of reach. This wasn't a disorganized charge, it was a lethal ballet of mobility and firepower designed to trap, disorient, and dismantle. At the Battle of Yehuling, this tactic reached its brutal peak. The Jin dynasty's massive infantry divisions, confident in their numerical advantage, found themselves encircled before they could even form proper ranks. Mongol archers didn't just shoot, they sculpted chaos. One moment, arrows rained from the front, forcing shields up. The next, a volley came from the left flank, then the rear, each salvo timed to prevent any cohesive defense. The Jin soldiers couldn't advance, couldn't retreat. They could only stand and watch as their formation collapsed inward under the relentless, wheeling assault. What made this strategy so devastating was its surgical precision. Unlike traditional cavalry charges that relied on brute force, the Mongols treated encirclement like a noose tightening in slow motion. Riders maintained exact distances, their composite bows picking off officers and standard bearers first, leaving foot soldiers leaderless and paralyzed. Without commands, even the bravest troops became easy prey. And when gaps appeared in the enemy lines, lancers would slash through, cutting the trapped force into smaller, helpless fragments. But the true genius lay in the psychological toll. Soldiers who trained to face a frontal assault had no answer for an enemy that refused to stay in one place. The constant pivoting of Mongol horses created the illusion of endless reinforcements, while the arrows, each whistling from a different direction, eroded morale faster than the bodies piled up. By the time the last volleys fell, survivors weren't just defeated, they were broken, convinced they'd faced something beyond human tactics. This was warfare distilled to its most efficient form. No wasted movements, no grand melees, just a calibrated machine of destruction that turned open battlefields into killing zones. The Mongols didn't just win battles with the horse archer swarm. They rewrote the rules of engagement, proving that sometimes the deadliest weapon wasn't strength, but the ability to strike from every angle at once. The battlefield is no place for pride, a lesson the Mongols mastered while other empires bled themselves dry in meaningless last stands. When the tide of combat shifted against them, they didn't cling to some romantic notion of honor, they vanished like smoke on the wind. To their enemies, it might have looked like weakness, until those same warriors reappeared weeks later, refreshed, reinforced, and ready to strike where least expected. This wasn't cowardice, it was cold, calculated patience. While European knights glorified death before dishonor, Mongol commanders treated retreat as just another move in a much larger game. At the Battle of Parwan, when a rare defeat forced Genghis Khan's adopted son Shigi Kutuk to disengage, his surviving forces didn't scatter in panic. They fell back in orderly columns, using their superior mobility to melt into the landscape. Months later, those same units returned with devastating new tactics tailored to exploit their earlier miscalculations. What set this approach apart was its long-term discipline. Lesser armies might retreat only to rout, their morale shattered. But the Mongols turned withdrawal into an art form, luring pursuers into ambushes, stretching supply lines until they snapped, or simply buying time for reinforcements to arrive from halfway across the empire. Their famed mobility wasn't just for attack, it was an insurance policy ensuring that no single loss could ever be decisive. The psychological impact rippled beyond the battlefield. Opponents who celebrated a victory over the retreating horde soon discovered the hard truth. You hadn't actually won until the Mongols decided to stop fighting back. By rejecting the sunk cost fallacy that doomed so many medieval commanders, they turned temporary setbacks into future triumphs. In the end, their willingness to walk away just to return stronger proved that true dominance wasn't about never losing, but about making sure every loss was temporary. Tactic 20, the false defector trust on the battlefield is a fragile thing, and the Mongols turned that vulnerability into a weapon. While other empires relied on brute force alone, Genghis Khan's generals deployed a subtler tactic, the carefully crafted lie. Imagine a ragged soldier, exhausted and bloodied, stumbling into enemy lines with tales of Mongol disarray only for his intelligence to lead an entire army into annihilation. This wasn't just espionage, it was psychological warfare at its most insidious. The betrayal of the Tangut kingdom in 1227 stands as a chilling example. After years of resisting Mongol rule, the Tanguts received a group of apparent deserters who revealed weaknesses in Genghis Khan's forces. Eager to strike, the Tangut leaders mobilized their army, only to find themselves marching straight into a meticulously prepared ambush. The defectors hadn't fled, they'd been sent to orchestrate their enemy's destruction from within. What made this tactic so devastating wasn't just the misinformation, it was the timing. False defectors often appeared after a minor Mongol setback, lending credibility to their stories of discord. They'd share just enough truth, names of commanders, real battle locations, to mask the lethal deceptions woven between the facts. By the time enemy strategists realized they'd been played, their forces were already out of position, overextended or trapped, but the real brilliance lay in its ripple effects. Even after the ruse was exposed, paranoia lingered. Genuine defectors faced skepticism, dividing enemy councils into factions of doubt. Commanders hesitated to trust their own scouts, fearing they might be Mongol plants. In the end, the false defector didn't just mislead, it poisoned the well of trust that armies needed to function. Few tactics ever eroded an enemy's confidence so completely without firing a single arrow. The lesson was clear. In war, information is power, but only if you can tell the truth from the trap. The Mongols didn't just win battles, they weaponized the very act of surrender, turning desperation into a Trojan horse that broke empires from the inside out. Tactic 21, the environmental trap. Even the mightiest army becomes helpless when the ground itself turns against them. While most commanders saw terrain as mere backdrop, the Mongols treated it like a weapon-forging battlefields where cliffs, rivers, and dense forests did the killing for them. At the Indus River in 1221, they didn't just defeat the fleeing Khwarezmian forces, they orchestrated their annihilation by herding them into a watery grave. This wasn't luck, it was deliberate entrapment. Mongol scouts spent weeks mapping every gully and ford, identifying choke points where superior numbers would mean nothing. When the Khwarezmians attempted retreat, they found their path funneled toward the Indus by seemingly random skirmishes, only to realize too late they'd been maneuvered onto a narrow stretch of bank with the river at their backs. What followed wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter as Mongol arrows rained down on troops too cramped to raise shields or flee. What set this tactic apart was its brutal efficiency. Unlike European generals who sought open fields for honorable combat, the Mongols embraced constraints, using dense forests to neutralize cavalry charges or marshlands to bog down armored infantry. At Liegnitz, they lured Polish knights into a maze of irrigation ditches, where their heavy steeds became trapped in mud, easy targets for mounted archers picking them off from dry ground. Geography wasn't just part of their strategy, it was the pivot around which every other tactic turned, but the real genius lay in the psychological aftermath. Survivors didn't just recount losses, they spread tales of an enemy that weaponized the land itself, making every hill, thicket, or river crossing a potential death trap. Future foes hesitated to pursue, fearing the very earth beneath their feet might be part of some grand trap. By mastering terrain, the Mongols didn't just win battles, they poisoned their enemies' trust in the battlefield, leaving them paralyzed before the fighting even began. In the end, their greatest ally wasn't the bow or the horse, but an understanding that nature could be as lethal as any blade, if you knew how to wield it. Tactic 22, the multi-front invasion. No medieval army could match the Mongols' ability to strike like a tempest from every compass point at once. While traditional invasions hammered at a single frontier, Genghis Khan's forces moved with the terrifying synchronicity of a pack separating its prey. When they swept into Europe in 1241, kingdoms crumbled not from one overwhelming assault, but from a dozen simultaneous lightning strikes, each perfectly timed to fracture any coordinated defense. The invasion of Hungary revealed this tactic's chilling efficiency. As Batu Khan's main force advanced through the Carpathian passes, a second Mongol army materialized hundreds of miles to the south, crossing the frozen Danube like ghosts. Local garrisons, trained to face threats from a single direction, found themselves paralyzed, rushing to reinforce one breach only to discover fires burning behind them. By the time King Bela Roman IV realized the scale of the onslaught, his forces were already isolated, their supply lines severed in multiple places. What made this strategy revolutionary wasn't just the chaos it sowed, it was the logistical mastery behind it. Mongol commanders operating continents apart coordinated through the Yam network, synchronizing attacks with precision that left enemies convinced they faced a force beyond human understanding. While European lords struggled to rally neighboring provinces, the Mongols moved as a single organism, striking Kiev, Poland, and Transylvania in the same season, not as separate campaigns, but as interlocking pieces of one unstoppable advance. The psychological toll proved even more devastating than the military losses. Defenders never knew where the next blow would land, turning every frontier into a potential weak point. Walls built to withstand siege became useless when the enemy simply flowed around them, and for those who survived, the realization dawned too late. No kingdom could defend against an enemy that attacked not just with strength, but with the uncanny ability to be everywhere at once. This was the Mongol art of war at its most sophisticated, turning geography into a weapon and time itself into an ally. While other conquerors hammered at gates, they dissolved entire empires by ensuring no gate was ever secure. Tactic 23, the silent march. While other armies announced their presence with pounding drums and clattering armor, the Mongols moved like shadows, ghostly, relentless, and utterly silent. Scouts tracking their movements would scan empty horizons, unaware that an entire force had slipped past under cover of darkness or through terrain deemed impassable. This wasn't just evasion, it was a masterclass in deception, turning invisibility into a strategic superpower. The sack of Samarkand stands as a haunting example. Defenders of the legendary Silk Road city kept watch for days, expecting the usual dust clouds of an approaching army. Instead, the Mongols traversed the barren Kizilkum Desert, a wasteland most armies avoided, emerging suddenly at the city's undefended eastern gates. By the time alarm bells rang, it was too late. Horses were already in the streets, arrows finding their marks before resistance could be organized. What made this tactic so devastating was its unnatural discipline. Mongol columns advanced without campfires, their scouts eliminating enemy patrols before they could sound warnings. At night, they muffled hooves with wrapped cloth, their movements synchronized through hand signals rather than shouted orders. Even their famed stirrups were redesigned to eliminate the metallic jingle that betrayed most cavalry. Against such foes, traditional scouts became useless, leaving cities blind until the killing began. But the true brilliance lay in the psychological aftermath. When an enemy couldn't trust the emptiness before them, every stretch of wilderness became a potential hiding place for doom. Defenders wasted resources guarding routes the Mongols wouldn't take, while the real threat materialized where least expected. In the end, their greatest advantage wasn't just stealth, it was the slow-burning terror of never knowing where or when the storm would strike. Tactic 24, the plague catapults. Long before the modern era of germ theory, the Mongols weaponized disease with terrifying ingenuity. During the siege of Kaffa in 1346, defenders watched in horror as lifeless bodies arced over their walls, not just casualties of war but deliberate carriers of pestilence. These weren't random acts of brutality, they were calculated strikes meant to cripple resistance from within. The tactic exploited a grim truth: a city's strongest walls meant nothing against the creeping horror of infection. As corpses rotted in streets and wells, dysentery and plague spread faster than any Mongol blade could. Survivors described watching neighbors, even armed soldiers, collapse mid-battle, their bodies racked with fever. Morale evaporated long before supplies ran out. What made this approach so devastating wasn't just its immediate toll, but its lingering impact. Fleeing refugees carried the disease to distant regions, weakening future strongholds before the Mongols even arrived. The Black Death's westward spread owes part of its nightmarish momentum to these early biological assaults, a ripple effect of terror that outlasted the empire itself. Yet beneath the brutality lay cold pragmatism. Why waste months starving a city when a single infected corpse could do the work of 1,000 arrows? The Mongols didn't just break their enemies, they turned nature itself into an ally, proving that innovation in warfare wasn't always about new weapons, but about reshaping the oldest ones into something far more sinister. Tactic 25. The Merciless Pursuit. Most medieval battles ended the moment one side broke ranks. Victors would celebrate while the defeated scattered, licking their wounds and vowing to fight another day. But for the Mongols, victory wasn't complete until the last enemy had been run down. They didn't just defeat armies, they erased them from existence, ensuring no survivor lived to regroup, rebuild, or seek revenge. The destruction of the Kipchak Turks stands as a grim testament to this doctrine. After their initial defeat, Kipchak horsemen did what steppe warriors had done for centuries. They fled, expecting to regroup in distant pastures. But Mongol riders followed, not for miles but for months, across rivers and mountain passes, through blizzards and scorching plains. No sanctuary was too remote, no refuge too hidden. By the time the pursuit ended, an entire people who had thrived for generations were reduced to scattered remnants, their military power snuffed out completely. What made this strategy so terrifying wasn't just its brutality, it was the chilling efficiency behind it. While other conquerors might spare retreating troops to avoid overextending their own forces, the Mongols saw every survivor as a seed of future resistance. Their riders, bred for endurance on the harsh steppes, could maintain a chase long after other armies would have collapsed from exhaustion. Supply lines didn't slow them, they lived off the land, eating what they pillaged from the very villages their enemies hoped would shelter them. But the real genius lay in the psychological ripple effect. Word spread that surrender or death were the only options. There would be no third chance to regroup. Cities hearing of approaching Mongol forces didn't just weigh their odds in battle, they calculated the futility of escape. Resistance began to feel less like bravery and more like suicide. In the end, their relentless pursuit didn't just eliminate enemies, it dissolved the very idea of resistance before the first arrow was ever loosed. This was warfare stripped of all romance, all notion of chivalry. The Mongols didn't fight for glory, they fought to ensure no one would ever rise against them again. And in that merciless calculus, they proved that sometimes the greatest victory wasn't just winning the battle, it was making certain no one remained to challenge you tomorrow. Tactic 26, the diplomatic bluff. A messenger arrives at your palace gates, his robe dusted with the grit of a 1,000-mile journey. He doesn't threaten or boast, he simply delivers a letter. As your scribe reads the words aloud, the room falls silent. The Mongols claim to have 100,000 horsemen camped just beyond the horizon, but here's the catch, that number is a carefully crafted lie. This wasn't just intimidation, it was psychological warfare wearing the mask of diplomacy. The Mongols understood something most medieval rulers missed. The right lie, told convincingly, could conquer cities without drawing a single sword. Their diplomatic envoys didn't just negotiate, they staged performances of overwhelming strength, weaving half-truths and outright fabrications into demands for submission. When the Jin dynasty first received Mongol overtures, their envoys returned with tales of endless herds stretching farther than the eye could see, omitting that many were the same horses paraded in circles to simulate greater numbers. City-states along the Silk Road, already shaken by rumors of massacres, rarely tested these claims. Why risk annihilation when a timely surrender might spare your people? But the brilliance lay in the details. These bluffs often contained just enough truth to be plausible. A ruler might hear of a neighboring city's destruction and assume the Mongol force responsible was 10 times its actual size. By the time scouts could verify the facts, terrified councils had already agreed to tribute payments or open gates. The Mongols didn't just leverage their reputation, they amplified it, turning whispers of their ferocity into a self-fulfilling prophecy. The lesson was clear. In the game of empire, perception could be deadlier than steel. While other conquerors wasted lives storming walls, Genghis Khan's diplomats conquered with ink and imagination, proving that sometimes the most ruthless tactic of all was letting your enemies defeat themselves with their own fear. Tactic 27, the seasonal warfare. While most armies trudged through mud and snow at their own peril, the Mongols treated seasons like a strategic chessboard, moving only when nature itself fought on their side. Their campaigns didn't begin with trumpets or declarations, but with meticulous calculations of weather, grazing lands, and harvest cycles. When other forces bogged down in winter storms or summer droughts, the horde struck with uncanny precision, exploiting moments when their enemies were weakest. Take their invasion of Khwarezmia, launched not in spring, when armies traditionally regrouped, but in autumn, just as farmers were hauling in the last of their harvests. Mongol riders swept through valleys stocked with freshly gathered grain, feeding their horses from enemy granaries while starving cities into submission. Meanwhile, their opponents, caught off guard by the timing, found their own supplies dwindling before the long winter even began. It wasn't just a military victory, it was a masterstroke of agricultural sabotage. But the real genius lay in their restraint. Unlike European crusaders who withered in desert heat or froze during Russian winters, Mongol scouts mapped climate patterns like generals studying battlefields. They avoided the Caucasus when mountain passes iced over, waited out Central Asia's scorching summers in shaded highlands, and timed northern campaigns for early autumn, when rivers were low enough to ford but before frost crippled their horses. Every campaign moved to nature's rhythm, not against it. The psychological impact cut deeper than logistics. defenders who expected seasonal lulls, when armies traditionally hunkered down suddenly found themselves under siege at the worst possible moment. Villagers scrambling to store food for winter watched helplessly as Mongol torches turned their hard-won harvests to ash. By weaponizing the calendar itself, the horde didn't just outmaneuver their enemies, they made time an unrelenting ally, proving that the greatest generals don't just command soldiers, but the very seasons they fight in. Tactic 28, the cultural assimilation the empire absorbed its enemies. Most conquerors ruled with an iron fist, crushing the cultures they subdued. But the Mongols did something far more ingenious. They turned the talents of their defeated foes into weapons for their own empire. Artisans, engineers, even rival warriors weren't just spared, they were recruited, folding their knowledge and skills into the ever-evolving Mongol war machine. This wasn't just pragmatism, it was a blueprint for endless reinvention. Take the siege engineers of the Jin dynasty. After their cities fell, the Mongols didn't execute them. They put them to work designing trebuchets and battering rams for the next conquest. Persian administrators, skilled in running vast bureaucracies, were drafted to manage Mongol-held territories. Even enemy cavalrymen found themselves riding alongside the horde, their expertise in new terrains making the Mongol army unstoppable across deserts, mountains, and frozen plains. Unlike rigid empires that imposed one culture on all, Genghis Khan's domain thrived on diversity. Chinese doctors treated wounded warriors, Muslim scholars kept records, and European blacksmiths reforged captured swords into Mongol blades. This constant influx of skills gave the empire a terrifying adaptability. What worked against one enemy could be refined and repurposed for the next, but the true stroke of genius was psychological. By offering a place in their ranks, the Mongols didn't just neutralize resistance, they turned former enemies into loyal forces. A Persian horseman who might have died defending his homeland could rise through Mongol ranks, rewarded for his service rather than punished for his past. Why revolt when assimilation offered power, protection, and a share in victory? This strategy didn't just expand the Mongol Empire, it sustained it. While other conquerors struggled to control restless subjects, the Mongols thrived by making their subjects part of the system. Their greatest weapon wasn't just the sword, it was the ability to absorb, adapt, and evolve, turning every conquered people into another gear in history's most unstoppable war machine. The lesson was clear: true domination doesn't come from destruction alone, but from the power to make destruction work for you. Tactic 29. The economic warfare. An empire doesn't just run on courage, it survives on gold, grain, and trade. While other conquerors focused solely on armies, the Mongols waged a quieter, more insidious war, one that strangled their enemies' ability to fight long before the first arrow flew. They didn't just attack fortresses, they targeted the lifelines that kept those fortresses standing. The markets, the roads, the merchants who fueled kingdoms with coin and supplies. Take the Silk Road, history's most vital trade artery. When Mongol forces seized control of its choke points, they didn't just loot the caravans, they transformed the flow of wealth into a weapon. Cities that once thrived on commerce suddenly found themselves cut off, their treasuries emptying, their artisans starving. In Khwarezmia, the Shah's armies crumbled not from battle losses alone, but because their troops hadn't been paid in months. The Mongols didn't just defeat armies, they bankrupted them. But the real brilliance was in their flexibility. Rather than destroying trade outright, they often rerouted it, taxing merchants who cooperated, slaughtering those who resisted. A conquered city might keep its workshops and farms intact, but now its profits flowed straight into Mongol coffers, funding the next conquest. Even the mighty Jin dynasty, with its vast wealth, collapsed when Mongol raiders systematically torched its tax collection centers, starving the imperial court of revenue needed to raise fresh troops. The psychological impact was just as devastating. Resistance became a luxury few could afford. When a ruler's subjects saw their markets empty and their fields burned, loyalty became a currency they could no longer spend. Why die for a king who couldn't even feed your children? The Mongols understood a brutal truth. Gold could break nations faster than any siege engine, and in the end, the sharpest blade wasn't steel, it was starvation. This was warfare stripped to its most pragmatic core. While medieval kings dueled for glory on battlefields, the Mongols played the long game, proving that sometimes the deadliest strike wasn't against the army, but against the purse strings that kept it alive. Tactic 30, the eternal shadow. How the Mongols ruled long after their fall, long after the last Mongol horseman disappeared over the horizon. Their presence lingered not in soldiers or banners, but in something far more enduring, pure, unshakable dread. Even as their empire fractured into smaller khanates, the mere whisper of their name could freeze armies in place, topple governments into submission, and force kings to pay tribute to rulers who no longer existed. This wasn't just a fleeting reputation, it was a psychological stranglehold that outlasted Genghis Khan by centuries, proving that terror, once perfected, never truly fades. Consider the fate of the Rus principalities. Decades after the Mongol Golden Horde's power waned, Russian princes still traveled to Sarai to kneel before Khans who held no real military threat, just the ghost of past wrath. European merchants crossing the Black Sea paid protection fees to officials representing a regime already in decline. Why? Because the alternative, risking even the slightest chance of provoking the Mongols' return, was unthinkable. Cities that had once burned under their hooves preferred empty gestures of loyalty to the nightmare of history repeating itself. What made this tactic so uniquely devastating wasn't just the memories of massacres. It was how deliberately the Mongols had cultivated them. Every pyramid of skulls, every razed city left standing as a ruin, had been a message carved not just into the earth but into the collective psyche of an entire continent. By the time their political power faded, the world had been conditioned to obey reflexively, like a dog still flinching from a master's long-gone whip. The most chilling proof of their success, nations that hadn't even existed during Genghis Khan's reign still trembled at Mongol echoes. When Timur the Lame, a distant Turkicized descendant of their legacy, marched through Persia in the 14th century, he didn't need to revive their tactics. The rumor that he might was enough to send defenders fleeing. That's the ultimate dark art of warfare, winning battles long after your death with enemies who surrender to shadows. No empire in history ever weaponized fear so completely, not as a temporary tool but as a permanent inheritance. The Romans left roads and laws, the British left language and bureaucracy. But the Mongols, they left the unshakable certainty that defiance invited extinction. And in that, they achieved something no other conquerors ever matched, ruling the world long after they'd stopped riding through it. The Mongol Empire didn't just conquer, it redefined warfare itself. Behind every shattered city wall and routed army lay a blueprint of calculated ruthlessness, a masterclass in how to dominate not just through strength but through relentless innovation. What made Genghis Khan's warriors unstoppable wasn't just their skill with a bow or their unmatched mobility. It was their ability to exploit every weakness, psychological or physical, long before swords ever clashed. Centuries later, these tactics still echo far beyond the battlefield. Modern militaries study their decentralized command structure, businesses emulate their adaptability, and strategists marvel at their psychological warfare. The Mongols proved that victory isn't just about resources. It's about outthinking, outmaneuvering, and sometimes out-terrifying your opposition. Their empire may have faded, but their playbook endures, a testament to the timeless power of strategy executed with precision. If this journey through history's most formidable war machine left you as awestruck as we were, hit that like button and let us know in the comments which Mongol tactic shocked you the most. Don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the strategies and secrets that shaped our world. Until next time, remember, the greatest empires weren't built on brute force alone, but on the willingness to rewrite the rules and wield them without mercy. Stay sharp, stay curious, and never stop learning from the past.